Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Ready to get those brain gears turning again?
Always.
Today, we're tackling something that I think we can all relate to. It's something that can trip us up in our thinking and maybe even lead to some decisions we regret. We're diving deep into the gambler's fallacy.
Ooh, yeah, that's a good one.
Yeah.
A classic. It's so interesting how our brains can really lead us astray even when we think we're being all logical and rational.
Right. It's like
Huh.
our brain is playing tricks on us.
Mhm.
So, for those who might not be familiar with this fallacy, can you give us a quick breakdown? What exactly is the gambler's fallacy?
Well, at its core, the gambler's fallacy is this mistaken belief that past random events can somehow predict or influence future ones.
So let me see if I've got this right. Like if I flip a coin and I get heads 5 times in a row, does that mean I'm more likely to get tails on the next flip?
Not at all. Each coin flip is what we call an independent event. The coin doesn't have a memory right. It doesn't know or care what happened on those previous flips. The odds reset with every single toss.
But it can feel like it should, right? Like the universe is trying to even things out.
I know. Our brains are wired to look for patterns and try to make sense of the world around us. So when we see a string of similar events, it's natural to assume there must be a pattern there.
And that can be helpful in some situations, right? Like if you're learning a new skill or trying to solve a problem.
Absolutely. Pattern recognition is a crucial part of how we learn and adapt. But when it comes to truly random events like those coin flips or the roll of a dice, that instinct to find patterns can actually lead us astray.
It reminds me of that saying about seeing shapes in clouds. Our brains are so good at finding patterns that we'll see them even where they don't exist.
Exactly. It's all about how our brains interpret information. And sometimes those interpretations can be a bit off.
So we've got these articles we're diving into today. One of them is called Gambler's Fallacy, the Decision Lab. And it's got this really relatable example about a woman named Jane who loves playing blackjack. She'd been on kind of a losing streak, but she was convinced that her luck always turned around on the fifth day of gambling. So she goes to the casino, fully expecting to win big based on this pattern she thinks she's identified. Well, you can
Right.
probably guess what happens. She ends up losing even more money.
Oof. Yeah, that's a classic example of the gambler's fallacy in action. James' belief that her past winning streaks on the fifth day would somehow magically influence her current gambling session is completely unfounded.
Like each time she sits down at that blackjack table, it's a fresh start.
Exactly. Those previous wins and losses, they have absolutely no bearing on the outcome of her current game.
So it's really all about letting go of that illusion of control, right? Accepting that sometimes things just happen randomly and there's no way to predict or manipulate the outcome.
That's a big part of it. And you know what's really interesting?
Huh.
Our brains actually reward us for thinking we've figured something out, even if we haven't. Have you ever heard of dopamine?
Oh, yeah. Isn't that the feel-good chemical?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's tied to our brain's reward system. So when we think we've spotted a pattern or made a correct prediction, our brains release a little burst of dopamine, making us feel good.
So it's like our brain is giving us a little pat on the back saying, good job, you cracked the code, even if we're totally wrong.
Exactly. And that reinforces our belief in that pattern, even if it's based on faulty logic.
It's like a vicious cycle. The more we believe in those false patterns, the more our brains reward us for spotting them, and the harder it becomes to break free from that way of thinking.
It's a powerful feedback loop. And you know, it makes me wonder, have you ever experienced this yourself? Have you ever felt like you were due for a win after a series of losses?
Oh, absolutely. I can definitely relate to that feeling, especially when I used to play online poker. I remember I'd have these streaks where I'd lose hand after hand, and I'd start thinking, oh, okay, this is it. My luck has to change. I'm bound to win the next one. Spoiler alert, I didn't win.
Haha. Yeah, that feeling of being due for a win, that's the gambler's fallacy whispering in your ear.
hmm
And it's not just limited to casinos and games of chance either. This fallacy can pop up in all sorts of areas of our
Oh,
lives.
I bet. So it's not just about gambling in the traditional sense. It's more about this underlying belief that past events influence future probabilities, even when they really don't. So what are some other real-world examples of how this fallacy can show up?
Well, think about something like the lottery. People buy tickets week after week believing that because they haven't won yet, they're somehow more likely to win in the future.
Like their losing streak is building up some cosmic lottery karma.
Right. But of course, the odds of winning the lottery are the same with every single ticket you buy. Past results don't change those odds one bit.
That makes sense. What are some other examples?
Well, another common one is in the stock market. Investors might hold on to a stock that's been declining, believing that it's due for a rebound. Or they might avoid buying a stock that's been performing well, thinking it's due for a correction.
It's like they're trying to time the market based on these perceived patterns.
Exactly. And it rarely works out the way they expect.
So the key takeaway here is that we need to be really careful about applying this pattern-seeking instinct to situations where randomness is at play.
Absolutely. When we fall into the gambler's fallacy trap, we can end up making decisions that are not in our best interest.
Now, you mentioned that the gambler's fallacy can show up in coaching as well, and we've got another article here called How Can I Get Lucky
Yep.
that talks about this. Can you tell us a little bit more about how this fallacy can impact the coaching process?
Sure. So one of the challenges coaches often face is clients developing these unrealistic expectations based on the gambler's fallacy. They might think that just because they've put in a lot of effort or they face a lot of setbacks, they're guaranteed to achieve a positive outcome, like they've earned it somehow.
So they're expecting the universe to reward them for their hard work.
Right. But the reality is that success is often influenced by factors outside of our control.
It's like they think they've paid their dues, and now it's time for the universe to deliver.
Exactly. And that can set them up for disappointment and frustration when things don't go their way.
Now, on the other hand, the article also talks about how the gambler's fallacy can lead to a fear of taking risks.
Yes, absolutely. Clients might avoid stepping outside of their comfort zone because they're afraid of experiencing another setback. They might think, well, I've had so much bad luck lately, I need to play it safe for a while.
It's almost like they're waiting for their luck to change before they're willing to take a chance.
Precisely. And that can really hold them back from reaching their full potential.
So it seems like this fallacy can manifest in two opposite ways, either by making us overconfident or by making us overly cautious.
That's a great observation.
Mm.
And both of those extremes can be detrimental to our growth and well-being.
Can you give us a more concrete example of how this might play out in a coaching scenario?
Sure. Let's say you're working with a client who's been going on job interviews but hasn't received any offers yet. They might start to believe that the next interview is guaranteed to be a success, simply because they've had a string of rejections.
So they're thinking, well, I've had so much bad luck, surely my luck has to change eventually, right?
Exactly. But in reality, each job interview is a unique event with its own set of variables and circumstances.
The past interviews don't have any bearing on the outcome of the next one.
Precisely. It's crucial to help clients understand that and to focus on preparing effectively for each interview, rather than getting caught up in these superstitious beliefs about luck and probability.
Now, we've talked a lot about how the gambler's fallacy can be problematic. But how do we actually overcome this fallacy? What are some practical steps we can take to avoid falling into this trap?
Thankfully, there are some really effective strategies. The articles we have, How Can I Get Lucky? And The Gambler's Fallacy, What It Is and How to Overcome It, offer some great advice. One of the most important things is to develop what's called probabilistic thinking.
Probabilistic thinking. That sounds a bit intimidating. Can you break that down for us? What does that actually mean in a way that we can all understand?
Sure. It's about shifting our focus from trying to predict random events to really understanding and accepting the true probabilities involved. Instead of thinking, oh, I'm due for a win, we need to ask ourselves, okay, what are the actual odds of this happening?
So it's about being realistic and grounding our decisions in data rather than wishful thinking.
Exactly. It's about embracing uncertainty and making decisions based on a sober assessment of the situation rather than letting our emotions or those faulty intuitions cloud our judgment.
And another important strategy is to question our assumptions, right?
Absolutely. We often make decisions based on deeply ingrained beliefs that we haven't really examined. By consciously challenging those assumptions and seeking out evidence to support or refute them, we can make more informed and objective choices.
So it's like hitting the pause button on our automatic thought processes and asking ourselves, okay, why do I believe this? Is there any real evidence to back this up, or am I just clinging to a convenient narrative?
Exactly. It's about becoming more aware of our own biases and thinking critically about the information we're taking in. The gambler's fallacy, what it is and how to overcome it, actually suggests a technique called red teaming to help with this.
Red teaming. That sounds intriguing. Tell me more.
So red teaming is a strategy borrowed from fields like business and the military, where it's used to test the strength of plans and strategies.
Okay, I'm intrigued. How does it work?
Well, it involves designating a team to play the role of an adversary or critic. Their job is to poke holes in your ideas, challenge your assumptions, and identify potential weaknesses before they become real problems.
So it's like having your own personal devil's advocate, helping you to see the flaws in your thinking before you make a decision.
Exactly. And when it comes to overcoming the gambler's fallacy, red teaming can be incredibly effective. It forces you to confront the possibility that those assumptions you're making about future outcomes might be completely wrong.
Wow, that's a really powerful tool. I love that. Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about the implications of the gambler's fallacy in the business world. The gambler's fallacy, what it is and how to overcome it, makes it clear that this fallacy can lead to some really costly mistakes in a business context.
Absolutely. Investor sales teams, risk management decisions, they can all be negatively impacted by this bias.
Let's start with investors. How do you think the gambler's fallacy might affect their decision making?
Well, think about it. Investors who fall prey to this fallacy might chase past performance or assume that a stock is due for a turnaround just because it's been declining for a while.
So they're basing their decisions on this flawed perception of what should happen based on past events, rather than on a solid analysis of the company's fundamentals or the current market conditions.
Precisely. And as you can imagine, these decisions can lead to significant financial losses. It's like they're playing roulette with their investments, betting on hunches and gut feelings, rather than sound financial principles.
Now, what about sales teams? How does the gambler's fallacy play out in that context?
Well, sales teams that fall victim to this fallacy, they often misinterpret patterns in customer behavior, and that can lead to missed opportunities or an inefficient use of resources. For example, they might assume that a slow period of sales is a sure sign that a surge is just around the corner.
Or they might believe that a successful streak means they can afford to relax their efforts, thinking their good luck will just continue indefinitely.
Exactly. And in both of those scenarios, they're making decisions based on this faulty logic that past sales trends will predict future outcomes.
And of course, that's not always the case. Customer behavior can be unpredictable and influenced by a whole host of factors that might not be immediately apparent.
Right. And that's why it's so important for sales teams to be aware of this bias and to make decisions based on data and a clear understanding of the market rather than relying on these intuitive but often misleading patterns.
So we've talked about investors and sales teams. The last area you mentioned was risk management. I'm curious to hear how the gambler's fallacy can affect decisions related to risk.
This is a really important one because mistakes in risk management can have far-reaching consequences. Leaders who fall into the gambler's fallacy trap might underestimate risks after a period of positive outcomes. They might think, well, we've been doing great. So far, we're on a roll. Nothing can stop us now.
It's like they're lulled into a false sense of security because nothing bad has happened recently.
Exactly. They might neglect to put in place necessary safeguards or prepare for potential setbacks because they've convinced themselves that their good luck will just continue forever.
That sounds incredibly dangerous, especially in industries where the stakes are high. Are there any real-world examples of this happening?
Yes, actually. The gambler's fallacy, what it is and how to overcome it, mentions a really interesting historical event that took place at the Casino de Monte Carlo back in 1913. The roulette wheel landed on black 26 times in a row.
Whoa, 26 times. That's insane.
I know, right? And as word of this incredible streak spread, people flocked to the roulette table betting heavily on red. They were convinced that it was due to come up.
But of course, the odds were the same with each spin, right?
Of course. But the gambler's fallacy had taken hold, and people were willing to bet and lose a fortune based on this belief that the odds had somehow shifted in their favor.
So the casino ended up making a killing off of people's flawed thinking.
Exactly. It's a classic example of how this bias can play out in a high-stakes environment.
It's a cautionary tale that highlights the importance of understanding and overcoming the gambler's fallacy, not just in casinos, but in all areas of life where chance and uncertainty are involved.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Whether we're making financial decisions, managing risks, or simply trying to navigate the ups and downs of everyday life, understanding this fallacy can help us make more rational and informed choices.
It's all about recognizing that sometimes things just happen randomly, and trying to impose patterns or predictions on those events can lead us down a dangerous path.
Well said. It's about embracing the uncertainty and making peace with the fact that we can't control everything.
That's a great note to end on. We've covered a lot of ground today exploring the ins and outs of the gambler's fallacy, but this is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to understanding how our minds work.
There's so much more to discover, and we're just getting started.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the gambler's fallacy, what are some key takeaways our listeners should keep in mind?
I think the most important thing is just recognizing that understanding this fallacy, it's crucial for making smarter choices in all aspects of life. When we can spot this fallacy in action, we can challenge our assumptions and really try to base our decisions on logic and probability instead of falling back on those faulty intuitions.
It's like we need to constantly remind ourselves that the past doesn't predict the future, especially when it comes to random events.
Exactly. I think that's a really important point. We've got to keep in mind that our brains are wired to look for those patterns, even when they're not really there.
So even though that tendency can be useful in a lot of situations, it can lead us down a wrong path when we're dealing with randomness.
Yeah, it's like our brains are always trying to create a story, even when all we really have is random noise.
That's a great analogy. So how can we become more aware of those stories our brains are kind of cooking up and learn to question whether they're really true?
Well, I think mindfulness and self-reflection are key here. We need to get better at tuning into our own thought processes and start recognizing those moments when we're falling into that gambler's fallacy trap.
It's like hitting the pause button and asking ourselves, okay, is this belief based on solid evidence, or am I just trying to force a pattern where there isn't one?
Exactly. It's about cultivating a healthy skepticism towards our own intuitions, especially when we're making those big decisions.
Now, we've talked a lot about the downsides of the gambler's fallacy, but I'm wondering, are there any situations where this type of thinking might actually be helpful?
Hmm. That's a really interesting question. Well, the gambler's fallacy is generally seen as, a cognitive bias that leads to bad decisions. There might be a few very specific contexts where it could actually be advantageous.
Oh, really? I'd love to hear about those.
For instance, in certain competitive situations like sports or negotiations, believing that you're due for a win might give you a little boost of confidence,
Mhm.
like a psychological edge.
So in those cases, it might be more about kind of harnessing the power of belief rather than making decisions based on cold, hard probabilities.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. But I think it's important to emphasize that this is a very nuanced and context-dependent thing. You know, in most cases, relying on the gambler's fallacy is likely to hurt you more than it helps.
It sounds like a tool that should be used with extreme caution and only in very specific situations.
Right, exactly. The human brain is incredibly complex, and our cognitive biases can show up in some pretty surprising ways.
Now, as we start to wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a final thought to chew on.
Okay, I like that.
What's something they should really think about after listening to this?
I think it's crucial for all of us to consider how the gambler's fallacy might be affecting our own decisions. I mean, we all have biases, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this one is so common that we might not even realize when it's influencing us.
It can be so deeply ingrained in our thinking that it operates on autopilot almost.
Right. So I encourage everyone listening to take some time to reflect on an area of their life where this fallacy might be at play.
Maybe it's their approach to investing, or their career choices, or even their relationships.
Yeah, any of those things. And once you've identified an area, try applying those strategies we talked about.
Yeah.
Challenge those assumptions and try to make those more informed choices.
Remember, recognizing the gambler's fallacy is the first step towards breaking free from it?
Yes, definitely. And by understanding how this bias works, we can make decisions that are more aligned with our goals and values.
And hopefully avoid some of those costly mistakes that can happen when we let those faulty intuitions guide our choices.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, on that note, I think it's time for us to wrap up this deep dive into the gambler's fallacy. But before we go, I want to give our listeners a little sneak peek at what's coming up next week.
Ooh, yes. Tease it up.
So we're going to be exploring a whole range of fascinating cognitive biases that influence our thinking and behavior.
These biases are like hidden forces shaping our perceptions and affecting our choices, often without us even realizing it.
From confirmation bias to the halo effect, we'll be uncovering the surprising ways our brains can play tricks on us.
I'm excited for this one.
So if you're ready to delve deeper into the world of human psychology and learn how to make smarter decisions, be sure to subscribe to The Deep Dive and join us for our next episode.
We can't wait to share more mind-bending insights with you.
Until then, keep those brains buzzing and remember to question everything.
And don't let the gambler's fallacy fool ya.
That's right. Thanks for joining us on The Duck Dive. We'll see you next time. You know, it's really kind of wild when you stop and think about just how much our brains are working behind the scenes all the time.
Right. All those machinations shaping our thoughts and decisions. It's fascinating.
Totally. And the more we learn about those cognitive biases, the more equipped we are to make choices that are truly in our best interest.
I couldn't agree more. Awareness is key.
Speaking of choices, we made the decision to dig into the gambler's fallacy today. But this is just one tiny piece of the puzzle when it comes to understanding how our minds work.
Oh, absolutely. There's a whole universe of cognitive biases out there just waiting to be explored.
And each one offers those valuable insights into the quirks and complexities of human thinking.
It's like a never-ending journey of self-discovery.
That's why we're doing these deep dives, right? To uncover those hidden patterns and help people make more informed decisions in their lives.
Exactly. Knowledge is power, right?
Right.
And understanding these biases gives us more control over our thoughts and actions, which ultimately leads to a better life.
So true. Now, I'm curious, what are some other common cognitive biases that you think our listeners would find interesting? The ones that really kind of make you go, that's so true.
Oh gosh, there are so many.
Yeah.
But a few that come to mind that are really relevant to everyday life. Confirmation bias is a big one.
Oh, yeah, confirmation bias. That's where we tend to seek out information that confirms our existing beliefs, even if those beliefs are totally wrong.
Exactly. We're all guilty of that from time to time.
For sure. It's like we're cherry picking the evidence to fit our narrative.
Right. And that can lead to some pretty skewed perceptions of reality. Another one that's really interesting is the halo effect.
The halo effect. Tell me more about that one.
So the halo effect is where our overall impression of someone influences how we judge their specific traits.
Yeah.
So, for example, if we think someone is attractive, we might also assume they're intelligent or trustworthy, even if we have no real evidence to support those assumptions.
It's like we're projecting our positive feelings onto them.
Exactly. And that can obviously have a big impact on how we interact with people and make judgments about them.
Wow, those are both really fascinating. It's amazing how much our brains are doing without us even realizing it.
I know, right? It's like there's this whole other world operating beneath the surface of our conscious awareness.
Well, I think we've given our listeners plenty to ponder today.
Definitely. Food for thought.
So before we officially wrap up this deep dive into the gambler's fallacy, is there anything else you'd like to add? Any final words of wisdom?
Just a reminder that becoming aware of these biases, it's an ongoing process. It's not like we can just learn about them once and then boom, we're immune to their influence.
It's like a muscle, right? We have
Yeah.
to keep practicing and flexing that critical thinking muscle to make sure we're not letting these biases control us.
Exactly. It's about staying vigilant and questioning our assumptions,
Hmm.
even when we think we've got it all figured out.
Love that. Well said.
You too.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to say goodbye for now. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the gambler's fallacy.
It's been a pleasure as always.
And to our listeners, if you enjoyed this episode and you're hungry for more, be sure to subscribe to the deep dive. We've got a whole lineup of intriguing topics coming your way, exploring all sorts of fascinating aspects of the human mind and behavior.
We can't wait to dive into those with you.
Until then, keep those minds curious and remember to question everything. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next time.